It was just another ordinary day on the bustling streets of a small southern town. The air was crisp, the sidewalks alive with chatter, and the sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets. Officer Bradley, a seasoned cop with a stern face and a reputation for being both no-nonsense and controversial, cruised slowly down Main Street in his patrol car. He was the kind of officer who had earned his badge through years of service, but carried a demeanor that some called unyielding, others called intimidating, and a few whispered was something much worse. As he drove, Bradley's eyes scanned the sidewalks, always on high alert. But then he saw him, a tall, confident black man in a sleek suit, walking alone down the street with a briefcase in hand. Something about him seemed to set Bradley off. Maybe it was the confidence in his stride or the way he seemed completely unfazed by the presence of the police car crawling past. Bradley rolled to a stop, his hand tightening on the steering wheel. Without much thought, perhaps acting on instinct or prejudice, or something he wouldn't admit even to himself, Bradley decided to approach the man. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the pavement. "Hey, you be called out." The man turned slowly, meeting Bradley's eyes with a calm, measured gaze. "What can I do for you, officer?" the man asked, his voice steady but polite. Bradley didn't like the tone. It wasn't defiant, but it wasn't deferential either. "Let me see some ID," Bradley barked. "What are you doing in this area?" The man raised an eyebrow, his expression one of quiet incredulity. "Is there a reason for this, officer? I was just on my way to work." "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Bradley snapped, his hand already moving toward his belt. Within moments, the situation escalated. The man, who had calmly tried to explain he was a law-abiding citizen with no reason to be detained, found himself in handcuffs, surrounded by a small but growing crowd of onlookers. By the time the patrol car pulled away, the murmurs in the crowd had begun to shift from confusion to outrage. "Did you see that? He didn't even do anything," one voice said. Another chimed in, "Why'd they even stop him in the first place?" But Officer Bradley wasn't listening. To him, this was just another routine arrest, another name to add to the books. He had no idea who he'd just taken into custody. No idea that this wasn't a routine stop. No idea that the man sitting calmly in the back seat of his patrol car wasn't just some random passerby. Hours later, as the man stood before the judge in a packed courtroom, the truth began to unravel. Officer Bradley was smug, ready to testify about what he thought was an open and shut case. But then the judge turned to the man, a hint of recognition dawning on her face. "Mr. Washington," the judge said, her tone shifting to one of respect, "is there something you'd like to say before we proceed?" The courtroom fell silent. The crowd leaned in, straining to catch every word. Officer Bradley froze, his confident smirk fading as the realization began to dawn. The man he had arrested wasn't just anyone. He was the state's chief prosecutor. "Sure, here's the continuation of the story." Officer Bradley's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, it felt like the entire room held its breath. He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking from the judge to the man standing in front of him, the same man he had pulled over and arrested just hours earlier. The man hadn't said much throughout the entire process. Even as he sat in the patrol car, he never once raised his voice or argued. That silence, Bradley now realized, wasn't fear or submission. It was something else entirely. The judge's words echoed in his head. "Mr. Washington." Bradley's mind scrambled to connect the dots, but he felt like he was a step behind, like someone had taken the floor out from under him. Mr. Washington turned slowly toward Bradley, his expression calm but unreadable. There was no anger, no smugness, just a quiet, steady gaze that seemed to peel away every layer of Bradley's confidence. "Your Honor," Washington said, his voice carrying through the courtroom with quiet authority. "I'd like to say a few words, but I prefer to speak with Officer Bradley in private afterward." The judge studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "That seems reasonable." The tension in the room didn't dissipate. In fact, it only seemed to grow thicker as the proceedings carried on. Bradley could feel the stares burning into him. From the gallery, from the defense attorneys, even from a few of his own colleagues who had shown up out of curiosity. He wondered how many of them had already pieced together what he hadn't until just now. Washington wasn't just the state's chief prosecutor. He was one of the most well-known and respected figures in the justice system, a man who had spent years fighting corruption and advocating for fairness. Bradley remembered hearing his name on the news. His cases were often high-profile, but Washington was known for keeping a low personal profile. He rarely appeared in interviews, and he avoided the spotlight whenever possible. Bradley swallowed hard, suddenly hyper-aware of how this looked. An officer detaining a black man without clear cause, only to find out that the man was one of the highest-ranking legal officials in the state. He tried to focus as the proceedings wrapped up, but his mind kept circling back to the arrest. Had he let his biases guide his actions? Bradley didn't want to think of himself that way, but there was no denying that something about Washington's calm demeanor had triggered his suspicion. The courtroom slowly began to empty, but Bradley stayed frozen in place until he realized Washington was waiting for him near the exit. Their eyes met, and Bradley forced himself to walk over, feeling the weight of each step. "Walk with me," Washington said quietly, stepping out into the hallway. Bradley followed, the silence between them hanging heavy. They didn't speak until they reached a small private office down the hall. Washington closed the door behind them and leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "You know," Washington began, his voice thoughtful, "this isn't the first time I've been stopped by an officer without cause, but is the first time it's happened on the way to the courthouse where I work." Bradley shifted, unsure how to respond. He opened his mouth, but Washington held up a hand, stopping him. "I'm not interested in apologies right now," Washington continued. "I want to understand something." He fixed Bradley with that same calm, unwavering gaze. "Why did you stop me?" Bradley hesitated. He could feel the defensiveness rising in his chest, but he forced himself to pause and think. The truth was, he didn't have a good answer, at least not one he felt proud of. "I thought," Bradley trailed off, then shook his head. "I don't know. I thought you looked out of place." Washington let the words hang in the air, his expression unreadable. "Out of place," he repeated softly. "On a street I walk down every week." Bradley felt his face flush. Hearing it said out loud made him cringe internally. "I'm not going to lecture you, Officer Bradley," Washington said, his tone softening slightly. "But I will say this, trust your instincts, but be aware of what's shaping them. We all carry biases. What matters is whether we're willing to confront them." Bradley looked down, nodding faintly. Washington pushed off the desk and walked toward the door, but stopped just before opening it. He glanced back at Bradley. "You've got a choice to make," Washington said quietly. "Are the kind of officer you want to be. People watching, and they remember. Don't let this define you." With that, he stepped out into the hallway, leaving Bradley standing alone in the small office, grappling with the weight of Washington's words. As the door clicked shut, Bradley sat down, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't just a mistake he could brush aside. It would follow him, not just in the eyes of his peers, but in his own conscience. And as much as he wanted to forget that day, he knew he wouldn't. Not anytime soon. The days that followed felt different for Officer Bradley. The routine patrols, the small talk at the station, even the paperwork, all of it seemed heavier somehow. The encounter with Mr. Washington lingered in his mind like a shadow he couldn't shake. He replayed the arrest over and over, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when things had gone wrong. But the truth sat there in plain sight. There wasn't one moment. It was all of it. The glance, the assumptions, the cuss. Bradley had been a cop for years, long enough to know that mistakes happened in the field. But this didn't feel like just a mistake. This felt like something bigger, and he knew he wasn't the only one feeling it. At the station, people were talking. They didn't say anything directly to Bradley's face, but he caught the looks. Some were sympathetic, others were cautious. A few seemed almost amused by the situation, like they were waiting to see how badly it would unravel. "Hey, Bradley!" Officer Mills leaned against the wall near the break room, stirring his coffee as Bradley passed by. "I heard about that thing with the prosecutor. That's rough." Bradley nodded but kept walking, hoping to avoid the conversation. Mills didn't let it drop. "Man, I bet that was awkward," he continued with a smirk. "I mean, what are the chances?" Bradley paused, turning back. "Yeah, awkward." His tone was flat, but Mills either didn't notice or didn't care. Mills took a sip of his coffee and shrugged. Could have happened to anyone. Guy didn't exactly look like a prosecutor. The words hung in the air and Bradley felt his stomach twist. Mills said it casually, like he was talking about the weather, but it grated against Bradley's nerves. "I'm not sure that's the point," Bradley replied, his voice tight. Mills raised an eyebrow but didn't push further. "Hey, don't let it get to you. Happens all the time." Bradley walked away before Mills could say anything else. But as he sat back down at his desk, the words echoed in his head. Happens all the time. That was the problem. Later that evening, Bradley sat in his patrol car at the edge of town, parked on the side of a quiet road. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving streaks of orange and purple across the sky. It should have been peaceful, but Bradley felt restless. He watched people pass by, families walking home from dinner, teenagers laughing as they rode their bikes down the street. Everything felt normal, but for the first time in a long while, Bradley felt like an outsider looking in. His thoughts drifted back to Washington. He hadn't seen or heard from him since that day in the courthouse, but his words still echoed. Be aware of what's shaping them. Bradley sighed, leaning back in his seat. He had always thought of himself as a good cop, fair by the book. But what if he wasn't as fair as he believed? What if all those years of patrolling the same streets had slowly warped the way he saw the world? He didn't like the answers his mind was giving him. The radio crackled to life, pulling Bradley from his thoughts. A disturbance had been reported a few blocks away. Nothing serious, just a noise complaint. He started the engine and made his way toward the call, but the unease followed him. When he arrived at the scene, the complaint turned out to be a misunderstanding. A small gathering in someone's backyard, nothing out of hand. Bradley spoke with the homeowner, exchanged a few polite words, and left without incident. But as he walked back to his car, he noticed something across the street. A young black teenager, maybe 15 or 16, stood near the corner, his hands in his pockets, watching the scene quietly. Bradley hesitated for a moment, then crossed the street. Evening, Bradley said, keeping his tone light. Everything all right? The teenager nodded, but there was a flicker of tension in his posture. Yeah, the boy replied, I just live down the block. Bradley could feel it, the same subtle wariness he had seen before. He wanted to tell the kid to relax, that he wasn't in trouble, but the truth was, he didn't know if the kid had any reason to believe him. All right, Bradley said after a pause, take care. As he walked away, he glanced back over his shoulder. The teenager was still standing there, watching him carefully, as if he expected something else to happen. Bradley got into his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The feeling didn't fade as he drove away. Later that night, long after his shift had ended, Bradley found himself scrolling through old news articles about Washington. Case after case, headline after headline, Washington's name was everywhere. He had fought against unjust policing practices, pushed for reforms, and taken on cases that others wouldn't touch. Bradley wondered how many other officers had crossed paths with him without knowing who he was. How many had seen him as just another face in the crowd, the way Bradley had. He shut his laptop and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. The next morning, Bradley sat outside the courthouse waiting. He wasn't sure if Washington would even show up, but part of him hoped he would. Bradley didn't know exactly what he was going to say. He just knew he needed to say something. As the sun climbed higher, Washington finally appeared, walking up the steps with the same calm stride Bradley remembered. Bradley stood, catching his attention. Mr. Washington, he called out. Washington slowed, turning to face him. Bradley took a breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down. I just wanted to say, I've been thinking about what you said, and I hear you. Washington studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. That's a good start, Washington replied before continuing into the courthouse. Bradley stood there for a while, watching the doors close behind him, wondering what the next step would look like, and if he was ready to take it. The days slipped by, but the knot in Bradley's chest didn't loosen. Even when he wasn't on duty, his mind circled back to that brief exchange on the courthouse steps. A part of him had hoped that acknowledging his mistake, even in a small way, might bring some relief. But instead, it only left him feeling more unsettled. It was as if the more he tried to move past it, the more rooted it became. It wasn't just about Mr. Washington anymore. Bradley found himself second-guessing every decision he made on the job. He'd catch himself hesitating during routine stops, searching the faces of those he pulled over, wondering if there was some invisible line he was crossing without realizing it. The tension followed him like a shadow he couldn't shake. One afternoon, as Bradley sat in his squad car watching the flow of traffic, his radio buzzed to life. A call came in, an incident at a small convenience store just a few blocks away. A suspected shoplifter refusing to cooperate with the store owner. Bradley responded, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline as he turned on his lights and headed toward the scene. When he arrived, he spotted a small crowd gathered near the entrance. The store owner stood at the front, gesturing animatedly as he spoke to another officer. Nearby, a young black man leaned against the wall, his hands shoved into his pockets. His face was tight, jaw clenched, but he didn't say a word. Bradley parked and stepped out, walking toward the group. As he got closer, something about the young man's posture struck him, the same weary stillness he had seen in the teenager from the week before. It was subtle, but Bradley could feel it. The store owner pointed at the young man. He's been hanging around for almost an hour. I saw him slip something into his jacket, but he's refusing to empty his pockets." Bradley exchanged a glance with the other officer, who gave a small shrug. He's not resisting, just standing there. Bradley approached slowly, stopping just a few feet away. "Mind if we talk for a second?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. The young man looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I didn't take anything," he said flatly. Bradley nodded, giving him space to speak. "Okay, then why not let me check, and we can clear this up?" There was a pause, a flicker of something in the young man's eyes that Bradley recognized. "I didn't take anything," he repeated, more firmly this time. Bradley held his gaze, but the tension was growing. The crowd murmured softly, and Bradley could feel the weight of their stares pressing in. It was a moment that could tilt either way. One wrong move, one harsh word, and everything could unravel. Bradley's instincts pushed him to act, to do something to defuse the situation, but he hesitated. He thought back to Washington's words, "Be aware of what's shaping them." Instead of reaching for the young man's pockets, Bradley took a step back. "I hear you," he said quietly, his tone shifting. "Let's figure this out together. How about you walk with me over here for a minute?" The young man's posture stiffened, but after a long pause, he gave a reluctant nod. Bradley guided him a few steps away from the store entrance, putting some distance between them and the crowd. "Look, I don't know what happened in there," Bradley said, keeping his voice low enough that only the young man could hear. "But I can see this isn't going the way anyone wants it to." The young man's eyes darted nervously, scanning the faces of the onlookers. "They think I took something just because I'm standing here," he muttered, shaking his head. "I didn't even step near the shelves." Bradley watched him carefully. There was frustration in his voice, but there was something else too, something Bradley couldn't quite place. "I believe you," Bradley said after a pause. The young man's gaze snapped up. For the first time since Bradley arrived, his guard seemed to lower, if only slightly. "I'll talk to the owner," Bradley continued, "but I need you to stay calm. Can you do that for me?" The young man nodded, his shoulders relaxing just a little. As Bradley walked back toward the store owner, he could feel the eyes of the crowd following him. The store owner still looked agitated, but Bradley spoke quietly, explaining that without clear evidence, the best course of action was to let it go. The store owner grumbled, but eventually agreed. When Bradley returned, the young man was already stepping away from the wall, clearly ready to leave the scene behind. Before he could disappear down the street, Bradley called out to him. "Hey." The young man turned, his expression cautious. "What's your name?" Bradley asked. "Marcus," he replied. Bradley gave him a nod. "Take care, Marcus." Marcus studied him for a beat longer, then disappeared into the crowd, leaving Bradley standing alone outside the store. As Bradley walked back to his squad car, he couldn't help but feel like he had just stepped closer to something. Not resolution, not yet, but maybe understanding. The line between right and wrong wasn't always as clear as it seemed. And sometimes the hardest part wasn't making an arrest, it was knowing when to hold back.